You are now listening to The Power of Gentle Talk with Anna Palacio, the talk that informs, inspires, and motivates.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Anna Palacio, and this is The Power of Gentle Talk, aired every Saturday between 2 and 3 on WBZT 1230 and iHeartRadio. Today I have two wonderful guests, as I usually do, and you're going to enjoy this conversation tremendously. My co-host today, Dr. Fleischman, who is an expert on trending and international policy, will be conducting the majority of this interview because I know you will get the most out of it, and I want my audience to really enjoy our guest today, Mr. Charles Small. Welcome, and thank you for being here today.
It's an honor to be here.
Mr. Charles Small is the founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, which runs a series of academic seminars at McGill University, Harvard Law School, Fordham University, and Stanford. He is also the Corrett Distinguished Scholar at the Hoover Institute and Stanford University. Dr. Small is the founder and director of the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, the first research center with focus on anti-Semitism based at a North American university. Welcome.
Thank you.
So happy for you to be here. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic, and especially with everything that's happened in the last couple of weeks weeks. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with the first question, and like I said, we'll have Dr. Louise Fleischman take over the interview after that. Okay, my first question to you is: are you you are the founder of the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism, correct?
Correct.
Okay. What made you fund such an institution?
So first of all, I'm honored to be here with you, especially I know you told me it's your 5th anniversary coming up in radio, so
Thank
it's
you.
Especially a special honor for me.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. So the reason why I started this, the ISGAP, or the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, was started in 2004. And so essentially, I was fortunate to have a good education. I went to good universities and studied political and social theory at McGill and the University of London and Oxford. And I was very much involved in issues of human rights, from the Soviet Jewry movement, freeing Jews from the Soviet Union, from Ethiopia, and also I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement. I was a leader in the anti-apartheid movement in the United Kingdom and Canada in the 1980s and 90s, and I was very active on the First Nations issues of Canada, Indigenous issues of Canada. And I moved to Israel in the mid-90s as a teacher. I was teaching in Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University, and I was part of a group of Israeli and Palestinian scholars that were trying to have rapprochement, to have more understanding and promote peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And this group would meet regularly at people's homes, and we'd try and figure ways to work together. And there was one man who every time I met, we would have these kind of very intense arguments. And he was a very nice man, a very cultured man, but we would argue. And when you study political and social theory, it usually when you meet somebody, you can figure out if they're conservative or liberal or socialist or religious or secular. You kind of you could figure people out pretty quickly. And I couldn't figure this guy out. I didn't know where he was coming from. And to me, he was saying the most outlandish things about not only Jews in Israel, but about women and gay people and civil rights. It was bizarre. But yet, he was this cultured gentleman. Anyways, after about 3 or 4 meetings of intense arguments, I said, give me, where do you come from? Where are you coming from? Give me some articles to read. And essentially, he started to give me articles from the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood was a movement that started about 100 years ago in Egypt that fused Islam and I would say European anti-Semitism together as a reaction to British colonialism. And the Muslim Brotherhood are basically the founders of radical political Islam, or what we call Islamism. And this should not be confused with Muslims, and this should not be confused with Islam itself. And I think there's a lot of conflation happening in American politics these days of conflating Islam with radical Islam or Islamism. And radical political Islam, which started 100 years ago, uses anti-Semitism, European anti-Semitism, to distract people and to act as a fuel to gain support among the masses. And what this support is doing is overrunning institutions, mosques, community centers, and even societies with a very narrow reactionary form of political order and of religion. And this is a movement which is diametrically opposed to democratic values like equality under the law, the rights of women, the rights of religious minorities, the rights of Christians and Jews, gay people. And this is an affront to moderate, decent Islam. And it's an affront, I think, to people who care about the other, who recognize people who are different. And this is a very dangerous movement, as we know now.
Yes.
And it started in Egypt 100 years ago. The foundation was with the Muslim Brotherhood. Offshoots of this movement is Hamas, it's Al-Qaeda, it's the Wahhabism of Saudi Arabia, and it's even in the Shiite world. The Iranian revolutionary regime, Ayatollah Khomeini, pays homage to the Muslim Brotherhood as the intellectual and philosophical and theological foundations of the Iranian revolutionary regime, which is Shiite. And their perception of the Jew, their perception of the American, their perception of women, of gay people are very similar and very reactionary. And this is a threat, as we can see, unfortunately now, that people are finally waking up to. But for the last 30, 40, even 100 years, they've been focusing on the Jew, focusing on the Zionist, focusing on the Israeli, demonizing the Israeli, demonizing notions of Jewish peoplehood, Jewish people themselves. And this was a calculated effort to distract the world while they promote their vicious, barbaric agenda. And the Israelis and the Jews have been on the front line for a long time, and now we see moderate Muslims in Syria, 300,000 people massacred over the last several years, 8 million refugees just from Syria, 60 million refugees emerging from this onslaught in the Middle East to Nigeria and now even affecting Europe. And this is a global problem that we need to understand and address.
Definitely. Now, obviously, you're a man of great vision because you set up this institute. At the time when you did, and you decided that it would be a field of study, I can see now the need, but at the time when you decided to initiate this institute, did you see it coming? You saw that this is emerging?
Yeah, so I studied issues of globalization and cultural identity, and I was studying how through processes of globalization and neoliberal policies, globalization was bringing people together as never before, but it was also marginalizing people at a very alarming rate. There were a lot of people sort of becoming marginal to political processes, to economic processes, and to social and cultural processes. And as the state was sort of being de-emphasized by neoliberalism and the state was weakening, making room for free market enterprise. This was the dream of structural adjustment and sort of neoliberal policies. There was a vacuum that was being created because as the state withdrew from intervening in the economy, from subsidizing food, from subsidizing education and healthcare, there was an increase of poverty and marginalization, and also, in a sense, the state and modernity was sort of the glue of many societies. It was the glue that had a vision of the future, a promise and hope of the future, that modernization and development would be coming to all citizens. But as neoliberalism kind of created marginality, this dream was also dissipating for many people, and radical political Islam came in to fill this vacuum. So as I started to read from this professor, I sort of immersed myself in the study of radical Islam in the mid-90s. Combined with my education on globalization, I saw this threat as being sort of really imminent in the sense that this was the perfect fit for the vacuum that was being created. And I saw how they were using anti-Semitism and perceiving women and gay people and Christians and religious minorities and moderate Muslims as traitors. That this was very alarming, and I started this institute.
Well, God bless you. Really thank you, because we really need that right now, the understanding, the education. So I thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and then switch seats with Dr. Luis Fleischman, who will take over this interview now.
Dr. Small, it is really a pleasure. And it's a pleasure for me also because I know you personally. We spent a couple of weeks together at the University of Oxford in England this summer with a very diverse group, international group of people studying anti-Semitism, including a couple of Muslims who join us. My question is, it's interesting that you say there is a crisis, like neoliberalism created marginalization, and so radical Islam actually came to fill the vacuum. Now, to clarify our audience, it's important to say that not every situation of poverty or marginalization leads to radical attitudes, correct? So there is something very unique in this phenomenon, right? Why are we seeing this, let's say, in the Arab world? Why is this emerging in the Muslim world, Arab world, if you wish? And let's say it's not emerging in such a way in the Dominican Republic with this radical dimension. I just picked the Dominican Republic as an example, okay, just not to take it personally.
So I don't know the answer to your question, to be honest, but I would say that in a sense, and I don't have the statistics handy at my fingertips, but I think that as marginalization is happening globally, we see an increase in violent crimes and violence. In places like you talk about the Dominican Republic. I don't know the Dominican Republic very well, but I know other Caribbean islands.
I just pick it as an example.
So we know other Caribbean societies well have become increasingly violent. I'm Canadian, and even in Canada, where there's strict gun control, and Canada was sort of a liberal, peaceful society, we see crime increasing and marginality increasing, even in a country with such a strong social democratic tradition. So I'm not so sure if violence is unique to the Middle East. I think it's endemic in many parts of the world. There's, in Ukraine, thousands of people are being caught up in this war and being murdered. And this is not making the headlines here often for some reason. So I think we're in a period of uncertainty globally, and I think this is most acute for all sorts of historical reasons in many Middle Eastern countries where states are essentially failing now. We have societies that are coming apart at the seams and failing. And this could become because of the history of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the global European powers roughly 100 years ago, sort of during the colonization and decolonization period, came in and drew arbitrary lines and maps and created societies or states quite arbitrarily. And I think what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria is the collapse of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, of the sort of European model of state building. And I think with neoliberalism, these societies were especially fragile, maybe unlike other places in other parts of the world. So we see, in a sense, scholars are saying that Syria, Iraq doesn't really exist anymore. It just exists on the map. But in reality, it's being broken up into different entities based on clans and kinship and
Correct.
Things like this.
In other words, there is a collapse of the state. But besides that, what is interesting is that doesn't explain it totally, right? Because what are the main characteristics of modern anti-Semitism? What is different, the new anti-Semitism, how is it different from the old anti-Semitism? And the question is, there is here an ideological component, right? That is my observation also as a scholar and as as a person that actually is living and interacting with you. There is an element of ideology that without it, and such ideology, is very unique. What can you say about modern anti-Semitism? How is it unique?
So I think if we focus on the Middle East, what's happened, in a sense, is that the Islamists fused European anti-Semitism with their political and theological worldview. So, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood famously brought the Protocols of the Elders of Zion from Europe and fused it as the part of the foundational element of its ideology in radical political Islam. And for those on the radio, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a forged book or a forged document that emerged in France or Russia in the late 1800s, which spoke about a conspiracy of Jews to take over the world. And what we have to remember with the Holocaust, that the Holocaust didn't begin with the railroad tracks to the concentration camps or the bricks and mortars in the ovens of the crematoriums that slaughtered 6 million innocent Jewish people. It began with words and ideas, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion were the ideas and the words that justified the marginalization of Jews from places that they lived for generations,
Right.
put them into
A
ghettos.
document that was basically created in Tsarist Russia.
Correct. Well, or France. It was a forged document that justified the marginalization and ultimately the extermination of a group of people. It's this document today that has been promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood that is now the second most popular book sold in many Islamic countries. It's the basis of a religious reactionary social movement. If you read the Muslim Brotherhood, if you read Hamas, if you read the Wahhabi Islam, if you look at Hezbollah and the Iranian revolutionary regime, they speak in the language of the protocols. They speak of Jewish conspiracies and the need, in black and white, not just to eradicate the state of Israel, but to kill the Jews. The leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was also the head of the Board of Trustees at Oxford University and the Institute for Islamic Studies, he calls for all believers to continue the work of Hitler. This is a man that occupies a prestigious appointment at the University of Oxford in Islamic Studies. This is the social movement that has relations with the United States of America. This is a genocidal, anti-Semitic, homophobic, sexist, anti-Christian, anti-democratic movement that we need to really, rationally understand and unpack and distinguish between this form of Islamism, this reactionary, racist, sexist movement, with Islam, with Muslims who don't want to be a part or lumped into this group, as now, because of the silence of liberals and the media of record and intellectuals, it's easy for people like Donald Trump and the National Front in France to lump all quote-unquote Muslims into one basket, which is very dangerous. So we have to, on the one hand, fight against this reactionary movement that is Islamic, radical political Islam, and just fight them, and yet distinguish between this substantial minority of people with decent people, citizens of the United States, citizens of Europe, citizens of countries throughout the world who want to live with their neighbors in peace and practice their religion.
Professor Small, something very interesting that you just mentioned, how come people with this kind of ideology have infiltrated the boards of, establishment institutions such as the University of Oxford and others? Do you have an answer to that?
Well, I think this also goes back to neoliberalism. There once was a time when the state and society paid for education and paid for health care and paid to subsidize the education and health of its citizens. And as the state withdraws, even in the West, there's a greater dependency on foreign funds to keep...
Or private funds.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that today with money, you can buy anything. In other words, those people who have money, let's say from oil money or for whatever income revenue they have, they can buy a place in the most respected places, institutions in our society. Is that correct?
100%. In fact, our group is doing research on the BDS movement, the sort of
Can you explain what BDS is?
Yes, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement.
An organized campaign to boycott and to marginalize Israel, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And what we've discovered in our research is that Islamists and other nefarious organizations are actually subsidizing and funding some of the best universities in the United States of America. And what we're finding in the last year, there's been three reputable studies that show that 70% of American Jewish students in American universities in the past year have either experienced or witnessed firsthand an anti-Semitic act. That is much higher. Other groups who face discrimination on campus, their levels are about 20 to 30%. American Jewish students are facing 70%. There's something that's happening in the United States, in part because of the funding of American universities by Islamists and bad,
but
nefarious
Professor
people.
Small, let me understand. These donors are encouraging this violence directly or is indirectly?
I would say in some cases it's directly, and in some cases it's indirectly.
Okay, given that, one of the complaints in the academia today is that the academia is losing its intellectual and its objectivity, what is called traditional research, traditional scholarship, as a result of injection of ideology. Are the donors funding injection of ideology? Are they funding bias for bias to be biased?
Yeah, I think some of the funding of by these groups are certainly supportive of an ideology that is anti-democratic. And I think, in a sense, on the one hand, we have the rise of radical political Islam or Islamism, and I'm not speaking again about anything. We have to draw the distinction, especially.
You are not generalizing about all the Muslims.
No, but if we have to draw the distinction very clearly, especially in this political climate, between radical political Islam and its ideology and Muslims and Islam. But what we're seeing is, in a sense, through the rise of radical political Islam on the one hand, and on the other hand, in the West, in sort of this postmodern moment, we have people like Michel Foucault and Edward Said, some of the two most important thinkers in the academy today.
Michel Foucault was a professor of philosophy in France, Edward Said a professor of English, but very much he was like a defender of the Palestinian cause.
Right. So these two very important scholars supported the Iranian Revolution, as an example, because they thought the Iranian Revolution was going to be akin or similar to what the French Revolution meant to Enlightenment and modernity, and they saw the Iranian Revolution as something similar. We know that this didn't turn out this way. So what we're seeing now is we have so-called liberals, and I say so-called liberals, who've gone through this sort of postmodern education, which I think obfuscates or dilutes or confuses liberal democratic principles, democracy, enlightenment, modernity, with sort of this anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-narrative, anti-grand narrative that democracy is based on. So yes, we should be critical of the underbelly of modernity, the history of racism and colonialism, and that's fantastic. But we are incapable today to distinguish between those reactionary movements in spaces that were once colonized that are truly reactionary and barbaric and dangerous, and with democratic values. So you have some of our policymakers who go through the best institutions in our country who were educated by people like Edward Said and Michel Foucault and the sort of whole postmodern moment, where they can't distinguish between a reactionary movement that wants to exterminate a people or subjugate women or kill all my religious minorities or remove them from society, and social justice and democratic principles. So we're in this sort of philosophical and political muddle in the West, and we're just maybe, because of the attacks in Paris and Brussels and in California and the massacres in Nigeria and parts of Africa and Mali, that people are beginning to wake up and beginning finally to question what is going on. And I think in Europe in particular, in France, after the Charlie Hebdo attack, the attack on the media and the attack on the kosher supermarket, which was carried out by members of a genocidal anti-Semitic movement that executed Jewish men in a supermarket on the eve of Shabbat, and our leaders still don't call it an anti-Semitic act. I think the French and the British and the Europeans are beginning to wake up to this barbaric movement in their midst.
Dr. Charles Small, thank you so much. Dr. Luis Fleischman, thank you. We're going to need to make a pause and give way to our sponsors. You are tuned in to The Power of Gentle Talk and WBZT 1230 and iHeartRadio. We'll be back in just a minute.
You are now listening to The Power of Gentle Talk with Ana Palacio, the talk that informs, inspires, and motivates.
Welcome back, and thank you so much for tuning in to WBZT 1230 and iHeartRadio. We'll now continue our conversation with Dr. Charles Small and Dr. Luis Fleischman.
Professor Small, you mentioned before that radical Islam is really is a problem not only for the Jews or for the Israelis, but it's a problem in general for Western society. They basically hold values that are totally contrary to anything that our Western civilization believes. And in fact, the last two major terrorist attacks actually took place, one in Paris and the other one in California. So that means that radical Islam is not only an anti-Semitic group, it's among others also an anti-Semitic group. But let's focus directly straight into what is anti-Semitic. We are experiencing boycotts of Israel at the levels that we never thought before. You know, the academia, already 3 associations, academic associations decided to boycott Israeli institutions. You know, the American Studies Association, the Asian Studies Association, the American Anthropological Associations, and not to speak about the Middle East Studies Association. Is radical Islam the only source of anti-Semitism? Do you think that there is a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Because some people say, well, in fact, I'm not an anti-Semite. In fact, I'm an anti-Zionist, or I am anti-Israel, but I'm definitely not an anti-Semite. But all these boycotts are definitely creating a lot of anxiety in the Jewish community. So is this only radical Islam? Is radical Islam influencing our academics and our academic institutions, or there is something autonomous here?
So I would answer by saying there's a mistake or a fallacy that stipulates that or believes that anti-Semitism is a Jewish problem. And I would actually argue strongly it's not a Jewish problem. In fact, it's a non-Jewish problem. It's a problem of those who hate. Number one, they have a moral and ethical problem. And what we've learned historically is that anti-Semitism is a disease, a form of hatred that is like a cancer. And once this disease is unleashed upon society, it may begin with Jews, but it never ever ends with Jews. And we can see even during the Holocaust, 6 million innocent Jewish people, at least 6 million innocent Jewish people were exterminated systematically. But we see that as the Nazis rose to power and used anti-Semitism as a way to gain popularity in societies, 6 million Jews were exterminated, 80 million Europeans were killed, the entire infrastructure of a continent was wiped out. So the death and destruction is not just pinpointed to one group. And here we see in 1964 at El Azhar University, the Muslim Brotherhood and others met, and they agreed because of the Achilles heel in the West is anti-Semitism. It's a form of hatred or racism or bigotry that's never really been, I think, assessed and eradicated in society like other forms of discrimination. At universities for the last 30 to 40 years, we have gender studies looking at how sexism affects society, affects our language, affects income. We have centers on racism and other forms of discrimination, of gay studies, where we look at how language and segregation affects society at so many levels. There are no centers on anti-Semitism, and yet anti-Semitism is the longest hatred, certainly in Western civilization. And so the decision by the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists in 1964 in Egypt was to use anti-Semitism to demonize Israel, to demonize the Jewish people, while they try to attack the West and destroy democratic principles, certainly in the Middle East and beyond. This was a weapon, and it is a weapon that they're using to attack the West and Western values, or I shouldn't say Western values, democratic values. And I think this is a danger to all people, and we can see, and this is the hypocrisy, and it's a disgusting hypocrisy of our intellectuals. They're boycotting Israel. They're boycotting or complaining about Netanyahu and the Zionists, and they use all sorts of things.
Netanyahu is the prime minister of Israel.
And that Israel's a racist state and a Nazi state and all these, disgusting caricatures of a society, of the only democracy in the region. So they're protesting and trying to start a boycott movement against the only Jewish state. And yet, 10 miles away on the borders of Israel, 300,000 people have been exterminated. 8 million refugees, an entire society is crumbled, and yet the intellectuals are not outraged by these.
You are talking about what is going on in Syria. Indeed, 300,000 people were killed in the last 4 years, and 8 million people have been displaced internally and externally.
Correct.
Yeah.
And yet, if Netanyahu says something, this becomes international news, and even the State Department, last Yom HaShoah, the last day last year when we commemorated the Holocaust, Kerry compared Israel to becoming an apartheid state when the red lines, and when this policy in Syria and Iraq has been such a catastrophic failure, it's outrageous that even among these so-called liberals, they're picking on the only democracy, the only true and true friend of the United States and Europe in the region, and they're picking on this small society that's in the eye of the storm. I mean, what's happening in the region is every kind of human rights violation, any ethical and moral standards of any religion or any philosophical framework is just being decimated and ignored in this barbaric ongoing massacre, if not worse, that the West has been silent. And now, as this crisis of migration enters into Europe, and we know some of the killers in Paris came with this wave of migration out of Syria, and this is a threat now to
one
Europe.
of them came with the wave of migration,
correct.
right?
Well, one of the killers.
Yeah, one of the killers.
Yes, and with the support of people apparently along the route. So this is a very serious issue that these, we're living in a globalized world. No man is an island, as the famous philosophical phrase goes. We're all interconnected, and we can't pretend that we can walk away from the Middle East, hand over the keys to countries like Syria and Iraq to barbaric, anti-Semitic, homophobic, sexist, anti-democratic thugs, appease the Iranian revolutionary regime, and infuse hundreds of billions of dollars into this economy and pretend that everything is going to be okay in Europe and North America. This is a globalized world, and we can't not only leave countries and pretend that we're separated from them. I think morally and ethically, we cannot afford in this globalized world to have a foreign policy devoid of human rights and devoid of morality. And that anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish problem, it's not just an Israeli problem. We see in California, we saw in Paris with the killer, Mr. Koulibaly, who went into the kosher supermarket and executed 4 young men shopping before the Sabbath, and he asked them if they were Jewish before they were executed. He's a member of an Islamist, anti-Semitic, genocidal anti-Semitic social movement, which is attacking the media, which is attacking the basic principles of democracy. And while Israel is the little Satan, America is the big Satan. And we in the United States know that this is our enemy, and I hope our leaders will stand up to this enemy that every American knows. Around our dinner tables at Thanksgiving, Jews or non-Jews in this country knows that this is a threat to our sovereignty and to our way of life. We know it. We're looking over our shoulders today because of what happened in California. It's here. And terror is designed to scare us, to terrorize us. And it's starting. We see it starting. And hopefully we'll have leaders, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, who will stand up for basic human rights in our foreign policy and protect our values and our citizens.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm going just to summarize a little bit, just so the audience understands what Professor Small was saying. And what you are basically saying is that anti-Semitism starts with the Jews, doesn't end with the Jews. And you say that usually anti-Semitism eventually leads to a larger catastrophe where people beyond pay the price. Like, rightly so, you said, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism eventually led to Germany's policies that were war policies that eventually ended up the lives of 80,000 people. Then I can remind you...
80 million people.
80 million. 80 million. I can also mention the Dreyfus case, which was an event of anti-Semitism, but basically was a monarchical attempt to destroy the Democratic Republic of France. Mm-hmm. So there is no question that there is all anti-Semitism is coming charged with something else. Let me move to another thing, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you alluded to that when you talk about the donors that actually are giving money to the universities and somehow are pushing an agenda that is not strictly an academic agenda. What do you think about the treatment of the Israeli-Arab conflict today in the academia? Do you think are we experiencing an element of barbarism, deterioration of the academia in general? the kind of literature that is being written, the kind of way in which the Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Arab conflict is portrayed, is charged with ideology.
And if you can do that in 3 minutes, because we'll have to wrap it up soon. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So I think political correctness is stifling discussion, debate, and even arguments in the academy. And I think, in a sense, even contemporary anti-Semitism, the study of contemporary anti-Semitism, is essentially a taboo in this postmodern Edward Saidian moment in the academy, in the American academy, in the European academy. And the political correctness is so strong that any critique of societies in the Middle East that were once colonized are seen as neoconservative, as reactionary, as Islamophobic, and all these sort of descriptive, derogatory terms. And I think what we need to do is, not in a colonial, racist mindset, but in a serious, scholarly manner, evaluate the societies, the contradictions and the elements and the complexities of society. And anti-Semitism is clearly an issue in Palestinian society, in Egypt, in the Middle East in general. And by looking at these problems of sexism, of the role of Christians in these societies critically, it's not that we're siding with Israel or Palestine or vice versa. We're scholars trying to understand the complexities of society. And we can't have this political correctness hindering us. So anti-Semitism in the Middle East has been ignored consciously by the intellectuals, and now we see the results of this. We see the implosion of the Middle East, and it's spreading into a global crisis. So we need to explore society, we need to be open, and I think that we need to sort of overcome this sort of taboo of looking critically at societies.
One of the things that actually I understand that we have one more minute, if I can ask another question. One of the things, for instance, that I find, and that applies a lot to the media, is the lack of objectivity and sometimes the obliviousness with which they judge the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Right. Like, for instance, the last time I've seen mentioned that Israel offered concessions to the Palestinians, I forgot when it was. Yeah. It looks like the settlements are the main problem. The Israeli policies are the main problem. And this continues to be repeated while basically looking at the Palestinians as some sort of, like a weak entity, lack of sensitivity to the security needs of Israel that is surrounded by a number of countries that are hostile. Anything that you have to say, you have half a minute.
Okay, in 30 seconds. So I would say that, if you think about it, during the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, I remember at Yale University we had a discussion before Passover, before Pesach, where 40 professors and graduate students all came together to discuss the notion of freedom and this emerging, valiant, social democratic Arab Spring. And everybody was going around the table saying how wonderful it was, and they were watching Al Jazeera TV to see what was happening. And every night we would race home and see Anderson Cooper running through the square in Cairo with his hoodie, and there was people chanting, and there were fireworks. It was very, wonderful. Very powerful images, but no contextual analysis. And I asked at this meeting, this was as the Arab Spring was erupting, has anybody read one social survey, one analysis of what these people want in the square? All I heard were Islamist slogans like Allah Akbar and other Islamist slogans that had nothing to do with democratic principles, that nothing to do with Rousseau or John Stuart Mill or Locke or Karl Marx. It was Islamist slogans in a society that's highly
But Professor Small, let me interrupt.
So let me finish. Is that it's the failure of our media, the failure of our intellectuals to do analysis. This was not a democratic uprising. This was not a spring. This was the Islamist winter that has led to death and destruction. And I think, in a sense, our intellectuals and the media of record has let us down by not seriously analyzing what's going on. And because of politically correct ideology in the media in the United States and in the universities, we've been unable to do serious, sober analysis of what's taking place. And now we are facing a catastrophe that is not only local, not only regional, it's become global.
Well, one thing I want to remind you, Professor Small, that you know well, is that all these ideas of democracy and all the authors and philosophers that you mentioned, they were denied to the population there. The only thing that was allowed to them was basically the mosque. The mosque continued to be open, and this is where radical Islam organized. But I think there was an authentic feeling of rejection of the authoritarian regimes. It was a very first stage of a long political process, I would say, right?
I'm so sorry. I know.
Yeah.
I would love for the conversation to continue much longer, but I know there's a time factor. I want to thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you
for coming on. Thank you,
Sorry
Dr.
to
Luis
rush.
Fleischman. Thank you so much. Well, to our audience, just want to say thank you. And remember, this is the Power of Gentle Talk. And when in doubt, go within, because I firmly believe that your heart is the true seat of intelligence. So keep an open mind, and let's talk again right here. Thank you.
You have just listened to The Power of Gentle Talk with Ana Palacio. Tune in next Saturday between 2 and 3 p.m. for the talk that informs, inspires, and motivates.